So hi everybody, welcome to this episode of Azure On Air podcast. Today I'm joined by Wagner Silveira. We're at the Integrate Summit. We're having a really great day on the second day here. I asked Wagner to come and join me because we want to talk about some of the developer improvements, and particularly Wagner was keen to talk about some of the testing improvements, as that's one of my sort of pet project areas, and he wanted to have a bit of a backwards and forwards conversation with me. So thank you for joining us, Wagner.
My pleasure, man.
I'm sure you're big time feeling the jet lag after travelling. So if anyone doesn't know, Wagner's come all the way from New Zealand to join us in London. So it's a really, we appreciate him making that journey. So Wagner, tell me this week, I guess before we go into the testing, tell me some of the standout moments for you in the Logic App area, that things you've talked about at Integrate this week, and then we'll jump into testing.
Yeah, so one of the areas that I work on Logic Apps team is the developer experience, right? And we knew that until a couple of years ago, that developer experience was kind of fragmented with a lot of cliffs. And we've been working really hard, the engineering team with me and the rest of the product group, trying to really hard create a little bit more of a cohesive story on that.
Yeah.
And we started to see some of those improvements on how easy now it is to install the extension, which was like a mission before, with almost a page long of steps for you to do. Today, we finally achieved what is that one-click install, which was the goal. But also areas that are really hard for customers to manage, especially if you are integration specialist and not a Azure engineer.
Yeah.
Like how to create those deployment scripts, make sure that you actually have an integration, enterprise story to integration. So those are two things that we really focused last year, and was really good to see this coming to fruition now, being GA for the onboarding, public preview for the deployment experience, and seeing that actually resonates with people.
Yeah, yeah. So if we move on to testing, so give us a quick overview of some of the test features that you've introduced this week.
So we did a sneak peek of what's coming in private preview by the end of June, and that is the idea of actually having a managed test framework for Logic Apps standard, which is something that we didn't have before, right? So a lot of times you would have to go and manually test, and if you have like too many workflows and you're having too many iterations of those workflows, all the testing becomes like quite consuming. So our goals was a couple of things. First was having an opinionated view or something that we could actually use. We had our idea of what a unit test for Logic Apps standard or for a workflow would be, the different from the traditional idea of being a little piece of code that I'm going to be testing. Usually what we test is workflow scenarios.
Yeah.
So I have a trigger that then has some business logic, and it then goes to a positive path and a negative path, and variations of the data that makes that happen. This is what we're trying to do with that unit test framework, right? So we've been calling that automated testing framework exactly because of that, because unit test, if people is too purist about the name, we're going to have a little bit of conflict about it.
Yeah.
Right. So the other thing that we're trying to do is making sure that we cater for different audiences. Like there is a lot of people that is really the integration or the business specialist that is using Logic Apps, and it really keen on doing everything codeless. We started with that experience. So the same, if you know how to use the Logic Apps Designer today, it would be really familiar for you to how to use the way that we're doing authoring tests.
Yeah.
Right. But we know there is going to be cases where either because it's too complex to create all those mocks manually, or because you might have too many permutations that you wanted to actually automate that with code, also providing a codeful experience.
Yeah.
So what we show here this week was the almost code complete version of the codeless experience, and what is our vision for the codeful.
So I think that's really interesting for me. And so just to recap for people there, so we've got two ways of testing now that are going to be available out of the box. One, you do a designer, like you build your workflow, but the designer's really designing your test. and then the second one's more you write the code that executes the test. And my understanding is that I can have a solution where I run those side by side in the same solution. Is that correct?
Yeah. So because of on both cases, when we're executing the code or when we're executing the tests, you're going to be going to the same execution engine, right? So doesn't matter which option you select for authoring, you're going to have the same kind of fidelity running the tests. And by default, when we write in C# code, you're going to be one part of Visual Studio Code that now is supported because of the workspace work that we did. When you're running the test for the codeless, it's going to be running directly on the blade, right? Yeah. And there is like nothing stopping us to put the two extensions, your framework of choice on top of the VS Code blade for testing, and now we're side by side, so when you run the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that was a really, when I saw your demo, that was a really sort of key piece for me, was that actually it just fits into the test framework that's already there. So you were just running VS Code tests like you would any other test, just executes, and you had the two flavors. I think that's a real, big tick in the box for me about what we want to see.
And that I think is the other key aspect of this was the testing runner that we're creating is actually just sitting on top of the Logic Apps runtime. Because one of the things that we're quite worried was how much fidelity can I bring to that test. It wouldn't help if you're doing something different for the codeless approach, the codeful approach, and when you actually run that during runtime. So we taking our engine, putting a little bit of layer on top just to say when you hit that particular action, if it's a mock, right? In very layman terms, when you hit that action, because I have a mock associated, instead of you go out, just return the mock. And that would be the same thing for the code for the codeless.
Yeah. So I think for me the codeless tests, I think, are the one that really kind of excites me quite a bit, because I think in the real world it's the blockers that stop people doing tests, and I think are the bits to tackle, because we hear all sorts of excuses of why people don't do testing, but the value for a customer really is the faster you want to go delivering new stuff, the more those tests become important, because when you need to change something or something breaks, they mitigate your risk. So I think for me, not having to write the code in tests, one less reason why people might not do testing. If it's just in the designer, you're familiar with it, and you're creating those assertions. Is that kind of really where you were coming from?
Exactly. It's like the way that we thought was like kind of the 80-20 rule. So 80% of the cases you probably would be able to use the codeless approach, right? And we actually thought about because of that, in some cases it might be too complex to create the mocks because either don't understand well the data or the data is hard to create. That's where we entered a little bit ahead and created that other functionality that I show, that if you've been debugging, which is usually what you do, you connect it to a system, you're doing testing your Logic Apps, you're debugging, you're going to have a run that you say, this is my case. Now I wanted to automate, and I actually wanted to make assertions of that. The other thing, the thing that we did with that is, as part of your viewing blade inside Visual Studio Code, you can say that run, which is what I wanted to test from now on and automate with all the assertions, create a unit test from that.
Yeah, I think that's a big one as well, isn't it? It's everybody starts by running it manually the first time, and if you get a run that does what you want, if you can just go, that's my repeatable test. You may change a few bits, but the scaffolding is the bit that again removes a reason why you might not do a test.
Yeah, and it speeds up the process, because if you have like 5, let's say Dynamics 365 or Salesforce, that is really hard to provide the data, and usually the data that is returned is huge, right? Yeah, if I have 5 of those connectors inside of one workflow, for me to create the mocks with the data that is relevant is going to take forever, right? Instead of that, now I can concentrate in just writing the assertions.
So when you come to the mock part of the test framework, do you view, just talk to me about what that experience would be like, and do you view that in the test I would mock everything, or would I optionally mock things where I wanted to.
Because the idea is exactly your scenario, like the path of your scenario, you don't need to mock all the items inside the Logic app. You're going to be mocking the things that are going to be either successful or failed inside of your workflow, right? And the other thing is probably only give enough data for your workflow to run to the point where you wanted to do assertions.
Yeah.
So don't have the expectation of you having to provide exactly all the data that the action has just to have the mock. I think I did that on the example yesterday when I go and started to create one of the items I just said and the items that I needed. When I get from create from run, then it brings everything because it was already on the system for me to bring. The other thing that is like on similar to that is when you starting to talk about assertions, we didn't try to create another language on top of that, right? Because in the end, assertions are nothing more than like a logical assumptions about something, right? We took the advantage of the big improvements that we did on the expression shape, which before was a bit hard to use. Small, we didn't have like a really good connectivity with some of the items. I think it was beginning of the year or end of last year, we did like a huge improvement on that. And that's the same component that we're using to create the assertions. So if you know how to create expressions in Logic Apps, you're going to know how to create assertions. And with that, like, makes it much easier for someone that's already involved in Logic Apps to create unit tests, right? Breaking all those barriers that we're talking about, like excuses or reasons why you're not able to get started with tests.
So just to validate one of my assumptions then, when I'm using the new testing framework, I'm assuming I'm going to be running my tests locally in my func.exe so that you can support all the mocking scenarios as opposed to testing when it's deployed in Azure. Is that
exactly? It's all local execution and all disconnected from your external connectivity, right? So the way that we're doing that is we're creating a new component inside our bundle, which is the test executor. And this is what is involved when you're running the tests. That test executor is just like a variation or like a skin on top of the function runtime to make those differences. And when you're doing the full codeless approach, we have another module inside of that test executor to run the assertions. Because in the end, the process is similar to what we have on a normal unit test, right? You prepare, you set up your mocks, you have what is your workflow definition that you're going to run. You execute that. The result of that is your run history, your run the run payload, and you do assertions against that, right? So it's similar the way that you were doing before with some of the samples that we did, but now you don't need to set up a whole environment behind and having to hit live endpoints.
So with running it on my local machine as well, I remember the sample Henry did a few years ago. One of the challenges was that I had to load up the entire runtime myself and deploy all the workflows and the config and stuff. I guess the framework takes care of all of that.
All of that.
Yeah. So you just design your test and just click run, and that's.
Yeah, and it's even more than that, right? That you create the tests, you swapped the blade, and then the blade is showing all the workflow structure. It goes all the workflows in the workspace, then all the Logic Apps in the workspace. For each Logic App, which are the workflows that you have inside of that unit tests. Then you decide, like at any level, you can run. And down to individual Logic App or the individual tests, you can edit, view the code, or view the results. So in your case, if you have a suite of tests for one Logic App, you can simply go and click on the Logic App's run. It starts the executor, like behind the scenes. You don't see any of that. You don't have any command to do this.
Yeah. So one of the things I think will be interesting as people start using the framework is going to be like when I looked at the assertions in the demo yesterday, I guess the question is, do I assert in my test every single step in a scenario, or will developers maybe, build multiple tests that'll maybe just start by asserting the first part of my workflow to make sure I can execute and I can query data from CRM, and then they'll maybe pause that test and they'll do another test that says, right, let's mock the data from CRM now and we'll focus on assertions about further down the workflow. Is that something you think people will do when they're using it, about breaking things up? So
I think it's going to be more down to the style, right? It's like depending on the complexity of workflow, you might want to test a part that is critical, and you might have too many assertions of that. If you try to put everything inside a single unit test or a single test, it's going to be too hard for you to find out exactly what is failing, right? On the example that I got yesterday, because the workflows, it was kind of what you would be doing today, but relatively small compared to some others, then I was able to assert all the items that I required for that. That for me was like a set of business logic that is executing on the logic apps. If you have too many permutations of that business logic, you might want to do like smaller tests around that. But the tool is going to allow for both, right? You can add as many assertions as you want, and you can mock the items to the point where what I'm saying on this one is like just the right path goes and pass. Then I only assert the logic of the first part.
Yeah.
Then after that, do the rest.
So one of the things I'd be interested to know about your plans would be, like I was always a big fan with a test of it being documentation. So I like that idea of, one of the challenges if you just see tick, 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 cross, you don't really understand the context of what's going on. So I always used to try and make sure my tests were very sort of, and this was one of my spec flow things in the past, was very explanatory, where a developer comes in, they might not know what the workflow does, but they can follow the test through. They can then correlate that to the execution in the logic app, and it kind of gives you a really rich sort of all full-rounded experience. Is that kind of the thing that you think you're going to do as well? Or?
What we're trying to do with that is like when you're creating the assertions, we're giving like a title so you can identify which assertions are, but we also having a description field. And we're thinking exactly like the way to document that is making sure that you created, you define the assertions, but also explain what that assertion, what business logic that assertion is trying to do. With that, then you're going to have everything inside of inside of the test definition. There is nothing stopping us in the future then to like harvest all that information and generate extra metadata out of that, as long as you put the information there.
Yeah, and I think the final question I'd like to ask, Wagner, I know this might be like more of a roadmap question, but I think the investments I think you've made, we said how they're very focused on the local developer experience, running with mock data in the workflow. And I think that's part of the problem. It's a bit that's always been really difficult to do, as to how do I execute all the different variations of my workflow. But I think there's still a test scenario about when I've deployed my workflow and then I've got my workflow plus my configuration plus my deployment working as a unit. What's the plan around testing for that? Do the tools help me, or is that something you're doing in the future?
That is something that we're still debating in a way, right? It's like the way that we created is abstract enough that if you wanted, we should be able to push that into the portal as well, and then because of that, running that there. But one of the things that that we're thinking and we're discussing with the team internally is, in theory, because the logic app, the executor is running on top of the runtime. If I don't mock anything, it was still going to try and go out to execute. Right? So the idea, and it's something that was really early stages to see if the assumptions that you have actually are valid, if that would be useful for customers, is if you don't mock anything and just assert, as long as you have your configuration set up on your settings to point to the right environment, you would be able to run that more as a system verification test or as a system testing, right? Versus running as a unit test, because the difference of those two is on the first one, you being opinionated about the data that is returning, so you have full control. On the second one, is you actually connecting to that to a live system that potentially is going to give you the result that you want, but it's have other variables.
Like if I think about what I'd love to say, I think mocking could still be very valid in that story. So I think that, exactly where I was coming from was deployment verification tests. So I'd deploy a new version of my Logic apps. I've got workflows executing, but I could maybe if my tests could be a part of the deployment package, and I could almost run them in the portal. But then some tests might say, like your green path one there, we just execute the entire test and it just talks to the systems. But there might be one step that's like an invasive operation, and I might have another test that says, execute these all in real time, but actually this one just mock that because we know that actually creates the order which we want to just mock out. And I think I can bring my risk right
similar to what we had for static results, but now fully decoupled from the system. So this is something that we are still discussing, right? And the feedback from customers like yourself is going to be quite useful for that. The last thing before we go that we didn't discuss, but this also comes into that system verification testing, is the way that we're creating this component. Because it's like standalone, you should also be able to plug that into your build pipelines. To give a little bit more of quality before you push to other environments, right? Especially if you have a distributed team of developers pushing to the same repo. So the idea is the same way that you're running that on Visual Studio Code, you'd have like a CLI command or potentially a DevOps task that you can just plug in and uses the tests that are on your repository, run that after the build. It's not the production verification, but it's like a build verification to guarantee the quality before it goes to deployment.
So when you do the demo you had earlier about generating the pipelines, that'll include tests.
That's the idea. So the same way that now that we created the deployment scripts for the basic stuff that is Logic App, we include in deployment slots, we include in custom code. One of the next steps, once you have this like round up in a way that can be used, is include a post build test before you zip to run the tests. And if the test fails, then you pause the build at that point.
Sounds really good. So we're just about time, Wagner. Thank you very much for joining us. I enjoy chatting to somebody about one of my favorite subjects. So
that's why I thought that would be a really good idea to have that chat, because it's something that we are both passionate about. And thanks for having me.
And I think we'd love to get you back on the podcast when there's a bit more to talk about in this space. But maybe after you've released it, I can try it out and we can sort of
have another chat with your feedback on that one.
And I'm first thing is I'm loving the fact that I no longer have to maintain that that test framework on NuGet and GitHub, which will be good. And I know I think Mark, who I was talking to this week, he's got a framework that's similar as well, and I'm sure he'd be quite pleased not to have to look after that anymore. But thanks, Wagner, and have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.